The last time we met, I talked to you about that 1-2 punch. The country that we love and call America is being hit with a 1-2 punch. The COVID-19 and what happened, the tragedy that happened in Minnesota. And I told you last time that these two things can actually be emergencies. That is, that it happens and then we go back to being just like we always were. That's an emergency. Then I told you there's a crisis possibility in that this happens and it provokes change. I said it was like a Rosa Parks moment. Remember the story of Rosa Parks? You know, sit on the back of the bus. Rosa said, no, I'm not. And it led to the civil rights movement and a great deal of change, needed change. And I said that that's a crisis right there. Now, we have the possibility in America and around the world, actually, of two crisis moments. The COVID-19, which leads to all kinds of changes that are going to help us with, undoubtedly, we will have pandemics in the future. We haven't had any in my lifetime, but we've had one in 1918. That hadn't been that long ago, 100 years ago. That's not long in history. And so as a result of a crisis, this pandemic being a crisis, we can come up with ideas that would change things for us in the future, and our children and grandchildren. Not only ours, but the people around the world even. And if we can let this tragedy that happened in Minnesota and now in Atlanta work as a crisis, and not just say, well, okay, it's a bad thing, we got to do better, and just don't do anything, then that'll just be an emergency. That'll be a tragedy in itself right there. And so I'm hoping that we can have these two crises in America and around the world. When I was researching this, I was reading a story about there were two men, and they weren't doing so well. As a matter of fact, they were pretty hungry. And a man comes along and has a basket of fish and has a fishing pole. And he asked these two men which one they wanted. And one said, I want the basket of fish. I'm hungry. And the other one said, I want the fishing pole. And so the man gave each one what he wanted. And the man with the basket of fish over a period of time ate all the fish and died. And the man with the fishing pole, looking for a body of water to fish in, couldn't find it and died. So there's nothing good about that story. Nothing changed. But if they had cooperated, that would have opened the door for a possibility. I think it's going to take, if this is going to be a crisis, it's going to take cooperation, and it's going to take some ingenuity. It's going to take some creativity. We can't just say, well, what about this or what about that? Maybe this will help. Maybe that'll help. We've got to really be thinking about what will make this COVID-19 into a crisis, and this tragedy in Minnesota and Black Lives Matter into a crisis. It's going to take cooperation, and it's going to take creativity. These two guys did not cooperate, and there was not an ounce of creativity in what they did. Now let's change that story. There was a wise man who came along and saw two men, hungry men, and he asked them what they wanted, and one said a basket of fish, and the other one said the fishing pole. So the man gave them the basket of fish and gave the other one the fishing pole. And the two guys cooperated. They started thinking and talking, and they decided that what they would do is they would look for a body of water that held fish so they could fish and catch some fish. In the meantime, they would survive by limiting themselves to one fish per day. And so they looked for the body of water, and rather than starving to death, they had one fish a day to eat. They found the body of water. They fished, they caught fish, they caught enough to sell, and as a result of selling fish, they made enough money to start a fishing business. And with their fishing business, they were able to buy property and houses and have families, and it just worked out entirely different than it did for the illustration previously. And so that's what it's going to take, I think. We're going to have some cooperation from everybody, not just one or two. And I tell you what I'm glad about. See, I was raised back in the 60s. And when we had protests back in the 60s, if it was about the Vietnam War, it was basically white. Now, there were a lot of blacks that protested the Vietnam War too. But the Vietnam War protests were basically white and mostly young and old, real old. But the protests by the civil rights protests, however, were mostly by black. You saw some whites, but the majority were blacks. Today, look at it. It's so much different. I had one of my black friends tell me the other day, "You white folks are taking over our protest." I thought that was really good. But you know, there's so many white people protesting today. So there's whites and blacks protesting, young and old, and it should be. Now, that's what I mean by cooperation. I saw this picture in the paper of these white women standing in front of black protesters, quote unquote, protecting them. Now that's cooperation. That's what it's going to take right there. And it's going to take that in your personal life too. If you've got a problem in your personal life or in your family life, it can be just an emergency. Y'all kind of make up and go back to the way it used to be, you know, and just grin and sort of bear it. That can happen in your personal life and your family life as well. Or it can be a crisis. I had a woman come in my office one time and handed me a can of spinach. And I said, "What's this for?" And she said, "Well, my husband has abused me for years. And last Friday night, he came in sort of tipsy, maybe even drunk. And he just gave me the what is, you know. He said, this is the way it's going to be, and that's it, and that's it." And she said, "No, it's not." And she said, "You know Popeye?" I said, "Yeah, I grew up with Popeye." He said, "Popeye, when he had stood all he could stand and he couldn't stand no more, he got out that can of spinach." I said, "Yeah, I remember that. And it was all over for Bluto, remember that?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember that." And she said, "Well, I want to tell you something. I done stood all I can stand and I can't stand no more." And she said, "And this can of spinach is my reminder." And I said, "Okay." And she did what she had to do to make that a crisis moment. And he didn't like it one bit. But he had to take it, you know, because it was a crisis moment. Now, that's what we need in our personal lives sometimes. And that's what we need in our family lives. And sometimes we need it socially. A social crisis where something happens, like for the COVID-19 and for the Black Lives Matter protest. And so keep that in mind now, that a crisis or an emergency, it's ours to decide which one it's going to be in our personal lives, in our family lives, and in the life of our country and our world. And don't forget, I said it.